Hey guys, my name is Aaron Wasbury, and this is my presentation for Performance and Limitations for Professor Brindley's 215 Aviation class. Kind of a subject in which this is referencing is the FAA Flight Proficiency, that's 14 CFR Part 61.07. So if you have any questions on that, you can refer to that. For this particular presentation, the performance calculations I'm going to be using and the performance numbers is going to be from my Skyhawk 172S made by Cessna. So the first question we're going to ask ourselves before any type of flight or before you're going to go out, you want to make sure that you know you're going to be capable of fly that day and both safe. So the first question we're going to ask ourselves is, how do we know what our aircraft is capable of? So a lot of these questions can be answered within our own POH or information manual for that particular aircraft. There's a few other questions outside of that we need to get into, so let's go. So here's a list of charts and graphs that we can use within our POH. We have the airspeed calibration chart, the temperature conversion chart, the stall speed chart in V speeds, which you can see at the bottom right over here. We have the crosswind component graph, short field takeoff chart, maximum rate of climb chart, time, fuel, and distance to climb chart, cruise speed chart, range profile graph, endurance profile graph, short field landing distance chart, weight and balance calculations, and know your daily weather. So any METARs that are out for that particular hour of flight, what is the TAF looking like? What are the hours upcoming maybe during that flight or after that flight is going to look like? Know your NOTAMs, PIREPs, AirMets, SIGMETs. You really want to be fully briefed before you walk into that flight. And finally, know your limitations. Establish personal minimums and stick to them. You make those minimums because you know what you're capable of. Okay, so the second question that we have now is, what can happen if our aircraft is overloaded? In this case, we're going to be outside of our weight and balance limits according to our POH. So here's a couple side effects that could happen accordingly. You'll have a higher takeoff speed and a longer takeoff run, which means we'll need more runway before we ever get anywhere. We'll have a reduced rate and angle of climb, a lower maximum altitude, a shorter range, a reduced cruising speed, reduced maneuverability, higher stall speed, again, V speeds, higher approach and landing speed, longer landing roll, and excessive weight on the nose and tail wheel. So ultimately, out of this list, being overloaded really doesn't get you too much. You might squeeze one or two people back on, or be able to squeeze one or two extra people on board, but ultimately you're going to need more runway to take off, more runway to land. You're not going to fly as good in any weather that you might come into, and you're not going to fly nearly as safe because you won't be capable of doing as much. Okay, so I have a little note off to the side which says, don't become a test pilot. So the numbers and performance calculations that are run within your information manual for your particular aircraft tells you what somebody has already flown, a test pilot, probably someone that's got more experience with you than you and possibly more hours. You really want to know what that aircraft is capable of. So ultimately, if you're going outside of that, if you're overloaded, for instance, you now become a test pilot. So that is something you definitely do not want to do. So our third and final question is, how do I create my own personal minimums? So I have 4 numbers here that we can list out, 4 questions to help us establish those personal minimums. Number 1 is, what is my aircraft capable of as far as information manual and V speeds? We have those again, so here we go. And number 2, what are my pilot and command responsibilities? So we can reference the FAA FAR 91.3, and that would be where the pilot in command is responsible and in command for all aircraft operations, whether it be emergencies or anywhere that you may be flying. Ultimately, the entire flight of itself and even taxiing, the pilot in command is responsible for what happens on that aircraft and how the aircraft, or what you're doing with your aircraft. And secondly, responsible for the safety of the aircraft itself and all passengers on board, which is most important. Number 3, what kind of weather have I flown in before? So if you're unfamiliar with the weather that the METAR or the TAF showing, but it's within the limitations of the aircraft, that doesn't mean it's within your limitations. Whether you're a very experienced pilot or maybe less experienced, you really want to be mindful of when you're going out, be like, okay, so I've flown in this type of weather before, and I had a perfectly safe flight and I didn't feel like I was outside of my personal minimums, if that's reflecting the weather that's on your briefing, then that's perfectly fine. But if it's something a little bit more extreme than you're used to, and even something similar last time made you a little uncomfortable, maybe it might not be a great idea to fly that day. And fourth, I have the I'm Safe checklist. This is something not only to establish your personal minimums, but to know before every single flight. So I goes for illness, any type of sickness, probably not too sharp to fly that day. Medication, any type of medication that you're on needs to be approved by your FAA medical examiner. Otherwise, by the FAA, you're not legally allowed to fly. S for stress. So what's a good question for yourself is what's going on at home? Is it putting you under too much stress in which you might not be able to make the right decisions because you could be distracted while flying? A, alcohol. Blood alcohol content needs to be below 0.04. Or you cannot drink within 8 hours of flying. So that's a big one for some people. F is fatigue. You need to get 8 hours of sleep the night before your flight according to the FAA. So make sure you're not tired if you're going up. If you're tired, ultimately your performance is going to be poor. And as the PIC, one of your responsibilities is to make sure that you're keeping everyone, including the aircraft, safe, and that you might be voiding that responsibility if you're any of these things. And finally, emotion can kind of wrap around again as what's going on back at home, what's going on in your personal life outside of flying, and how is that going to affect you today. And finally, I have my V-speeds down here, everything from VG to VNE. These are something you want to be familiar with your aircraft. Not only familiar with, but you you do really want to memorize them. By memorizing these, you will know instantly what your aircraft is capable of and whether it's going to be safe for you to embark on whatever maneuver or possible thing you could be doing with your aircraft. So guys, ultimately for our performance and limitations, these are 3 big questions that we can ask ourselves both before every single flight, in the briefing before, talk about it in the debrief afterwards, or even during the flight. These are questions that we can still ask ourselves and wonder if we're still conducting ourselves professionally and safe. Anyways, thanks guys, fly safe, and have a great day.